Welcome to the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast.
Hi, I'm David Manti, and welcome to a new episode of the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast. With me today are Donald Naugler and Mark Clemons with VJ Scientific. Thank you both very much for joining me today.
Hi, thank you for having us.
Well, before we get started, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the podcast. You can also help us out a lot by leaving the podcast a positive review on whatever platform you use. If you want to email the podcast, you can reach me at david@cannabisequipmentnews.com, and please be sure to subscribe to our daily newsletter. Donald and Mark, I always like to get to know a little bit about how people came to the cannabis industry, and I actually want to start by apologizing. Man, we've rescheduled this thing so many times. And that is just 100% on me, and a mix of the holidays and having small children. I'm so sorry.
Yeah, not a problem. Yeah, we understand.
So, Donald, I'll start with you. How was it that you found your way into the cannabis industry?
Okay. I've been involved with X-Ray, with the VJ Group and prior employers with X-Ray for now almost 30 years. And we've looked at a lot of different applications, from medical to security, industrial inspection, that sort of thing. And we came across some interesting requirements a while back that led us towards food and medicinal type applications. And as we were learning about that, studying, we actually came across the need in cannabis. And that seemed to be one of the strongest needs. So we started digging into it about a year ago, and it's been a great ride.
What were some of those interesting requirements that you found?
Well, for instance, we looked at things like sushi, trying to do phytosanitary treatments. In other words, killing anything that might be alive inside of it. We actually got involved in a study early on in COVID as well, trying to kill the COVID virus. And that led us to start studying more what's happening in the food industry. We actually have one of our divisions working on the border of the Mexico-United States border, and they're treating food on the way in. So we decided that was something that looked like a very interesting new application for us, and that led us to cannabis.
Interesting. Mark, how about yourself?
Yeah, the same. I mean, always looking for new opportunities in X-ray. And like Don said, we've got a lot of experience over 30 years in X-ray. And I was going to say, unless you, don't read the news or you live under a rock, everybody knows that the cannabis industry is a growth industry and has become legal in many, many states, both medicinally and adult use. So, just as a matter of kind of, balancing our portfolio and so forth, we decided to go into this area.
Well, I live in Madison, Wisconsin, and you'd be amazed as to how many people are still under that rock. We're here today to talk about clean cannabis. Is VJ Scientific completely in cannabis remediation, or are there other applications?
No, I think for right now it's remediation. I mean, there may be other potential opportunities. I mean, the company VJ Group overall historically has been in X-ray for, like Don said, 30 years. And so there may be other, avenues that we could pursue, but right now it's remediation. We're very focused on that.
Don, when you talk about X-ray, can you explain the process to me? What is it that VJ Scientific offers the cannabis community, and how does it work?
Okay, sure. Basically, X-ray is a high energy photon. It has the capability of penetrating. People are familiar with medical X-ray, where you can actually see inside of the body and see if you have broken bones and so on. That penetration capability is actually very useful in going through the full bulk of cannabis. There's a lot of different treatments out if you're trying to kill biological contamination, such as gases and UV light and so on. But the X-ray is unique in that it can penetrate deep into the bud. And what happens is the high energy interacts with the DNA of all living organisms. That's why it's not detrimental to the weed after it's been harvested. It's no longer alive. So the only thing that might be alive is something you don't want there. And the X-ray is able to basically deactivate whatever's in there that's still alive.
how costly can failed microbial testing be for a cannabis operator?
I mean, it can be really expensive. Given the price of a pound of weed today, there's been some price erosion, but even still, if it was an average of $1,000 or $2,000 a pound, it doesn't take long before you add up a lot of costs. And for the generally, you're probably going to have most growers have something between 15 and 20% that does not pass their state's regulations. So it can add up pretty quickly, especially for the bigger growers.
So at VJ Scientific, is it only the CX1000 machine, or do you have a number of products that people can use for this remediation?
It's just the CX1000 right now. We wanted to keep things really simple, and that's the way, in fact, that the machine is designed. It's a very simple platform, for both the operator and process engineers or people in cultivation that can help set the machine up. So it's just it's very simple.
Okay. Is it plug and play simple, or does it take a little bit of training?
I would say very little training, really. One of the things that's unique about our product is we've got a built-in dose sensor. So, the lab manager or QC or whatever person's in charge will have to understand what we refer to as the bioburden. What is the level of contamination that's in there? And they may adjust the process based on that, but we believe most people have settled on a certain dose, 2 kilogray, as being kind of the magic recipe that's going to work for most every situation that's out there. So having the internal probe in there is kind of like an oven thermometer you might think of in the cooking world. You basically set what you want to achieve, and it figures out what it has to do in order to achieve that. So if you put in a target of 2 kilogray, the dose probe will know when 2 kilogray is delivered, regardless if you have a 5-pound batch, 15-pound batch, or so on. Also, regardless of things such as the density of the bud, moisture content, that sort of thing, which can impact the speed of the process.
When it comes to other remediation tactics, how does X-ray stack up? Is it more on the costly end, but it's a more efficient or more exact process? How does it compare to some of the other remediation solutions on the market?
Yeah, I mean, it's well recognized that X-ray is the best technology out there because, as Don was explaining before, it penetrates the entire flower bud. Whereas other technologies, may be slightly less costly, but they only can penetrate so much on the outside of the flower. So
when we talk about cost, what does the CX1000 start at, and what type of ROI do people look at when they're thinking about bringing it in-house?
So we generally say that for a 30,000 square foot grow site, the payback on the machine is going to be less than a year. Oh, wow. Again, based on the 15 to 20% failed testing yield. So general rule of thumb for any kind of equipment is generally if you can pay it back in a year, that's a good gauge.
Right. And are these suitable to mid and large scale operators, or is it kind of anyone on the spectrum that it would be a fit for?
It's generally, there's two ways to answer that. So one, it is so costly to have to throw, product away that you can make money back pretty quickly. But on the other hand, for mid and large scale growers, but for the smaller growers, one of the trends we're seeing in the industry are people are doing what they've termed tolling. So in other words, people would set up a service and use a product like ours to remediate maybe competitors' cannabis and provide that as a service.
And they're calling that tolling?
Tolling, like toll booth.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a really interesting way to kind of help cut the cost of the machine and introduce a new revenue stream.
Exactly. It's we briefly contemplated a service of our own, but we're really not experts. We'd rather leave that up to our customers, the cannabis growers, who know a lot more about regulations in their own states. Again, rather than doing it ourselves, we want to focus on what we do best, which is technology driven products like the CX-1000.
No, I understand that. Are there service bureaus that are outside of growers and operators catering to competitors? Are there service bureaus or labs that are bringing it in-house?
We haven't seen it yet, though it's very common, especially across the European, for instance, the Netherlands, who for over a decade have been requiring treatment like this for any of their medicinal cannabis. In their case, they actually require gamma radiation. Gamma radiation is very similar to X-ray, except it uses radioactive material, cobalt-60, for instance. And the regulations around handling the radioactive materials are so tight that is prescribed only through service providers. There isn't any reasonable way that individual growers and producers could do it on their own. So every bit of medicinal product sold in the Netherlands has to go through this process through a service. I believe there's a bit of that going on in Canada as well.
Okay. How long is a cycle, and what is a typical batch size? Like, how much cannabis can you get into the machine, and how long does it take for the remediation process?
Well, our system is designed for a maximum of about 25 pounds, and it really depends on the characteristics of the product that's going in there. But what we've seen, for instance, in the state of Massachusetts, a batch is limited by regulations to 15 pounds or less. So probably in many states, you'll see that being the largest individual batch going through at any one time. And for a typical dose of 2 kilogram that we talked about, you're probably going to see between 6 and 8 hours of process time.
Okay. Are there any safety risks with operating the machine, being around the machine? Because I know that there's probably a lot of misconceptions when it comes to X-ray out there. I'd like to debunk some of those.
Sure. Talking about safety in any X-ray product, any X-ray piece of equipment is regulated by the FDA in the United States and other bodies across, different countries. And the requirements are very strict and stringent, and everybody follows similar paths. So it's a completely lead-lined enclosure. So the X-ray radiation really doesn't escape, except for something in the noise level, something similar to standing next to a television, for instance. Everything has a double redundant interlock, so there's no way that it could possibly be energized when a door is open or a service is being provided. When I say service, I mean preventive maintenance, that sort of thing. So it's inherently safe, and so that's for the operator or the people working around it. And the fact that X-ray is like a light bulb, it's either on or off, means there's nothing residual left over once the processing has taken place.
There's nothing like this gas oven scandal going on where it's slowly leaking all the time?
No, that's nothing like that. And as I say, it is highly regulated, nothing to do with cannabis itself, just what's required by law for any piece of equipment similar to this.
So I read that post-harvest remediation will be a major industry movement in 2023. What is forcing that change?
I think it's a lot of the consumer. I mean, I think we've seen in some states, I think Michigan maybe and Colorado, I'm not quite sure, but where they've played around, the state has played around with the regulations as far as limits and so forth. But I think over time, the consumer is going to demand more and more stringent limits on mold and bacteria. It just makes sense. I mean, you wouldn't tolerate that on your spinach.
Right.
So, why would you tolerate it on your cannabis? And in fact, we're probably going to see it in Europe sooner than the U.S. and other areas, but they may actually require that cannabis is decontaminated with X-ray because it is the best technology.
Is it the sensor that's in the machine that can detect whether or not anything's living on the buds?
No, that has to be done by a lab outside.
Okay.
That's right. There's various methods to test it, and one of the more common, which is called plating, actually tries to activate the living organisms and propagate the growth, and it measures whether there's any growth taking place over a matter of 1 to 2 days.
Okay. Yeah, I wanted to make sure that wasn't built into the machine, because I'm like, man,
that would be great if you could, but
it'd be great. Maybe some conflict of interest there too. So.
Yeah.
So it's also my understanding that the CX1000 also can work. It's not just post-harvest, but it's also after it's been packaged that it can be possibly used. Is that accurate?
It is.
It is.
It is. It really, when we set out to design this product, we wanted to make sure that we did not require the operators at our customer sites to have to change their process at all. So if they're using bins today, or they're using what's commonly known as turkey bags, or retail packaging. I know in some states the testing requires that it's tested at the retail stage. So if it's pre-rolls or canisters or whatever, those can simply be loaded onto our tray with no other modification of the machine whatsoever. So you can essentially put anything in there that's within the X-ray beam.
Well, I think that's particularly impressive because there's an additional step, but beyond the additional step of the process, there's no rework.
Correct. Again, X-ray goes through everything. I think, most people know that, except lead. So unless you're packaging your cannabis in lead, pretty much, anything will work.
I think if you're packaging it in lead, there's just a host of other problems there.
Right. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
How are you able to ensure decontamination without overprocessing?
Well, that's one of the advantages of doing some of the things that we're doing, like our dual source irradiation. We've worked very hard to achieve what's called dose uniformity, or it's reported as the dose uniformity ratio. So basically, you're avoiding the risk of overcooking some areas and undercooking other areas. It's going to be very uniform throughout the process. So once you establish the need to, apply a certain dose, that combined with our internal probe will assure that you're delivering the dose that you think you are, and you're delivering it uniformly throughout the whole bulk of your batch.
Where do you guys stand in terms of predictions for federal regulation? And would federal regulation help your business, or would it harm it?
I would say it's probably going to help it as we become more uniform, because it's the process and the product itself become regulated by the federal government. Then they're going to tend to be probably a lot more strict in the testing requirements and possibly prescriptive in the process for remediation when it takes place.
Mark?
Yeah, David, I wanted to go back to something you asked before about capacity and the cycle time and so forth. So one of the things we've done is the sources, there's one at the bottom, one at the top, and the product, the cannabis, is in between. And that's how we get our dose uniformity very low, very consistent. Those sources can be moved closer to each other if the batch size is smaller. Okay. So, there's something called the inverse square law with any kind of electromagnetic energy, X-ray included, so that if you move the source half as much, closer to the cannabis, the amount of energy increases by 4 times, 2 squared. Okay. So it really speeds up the cycle time, and that's something that we wanted to make sure, because again, maybe in some states like Massachusetts, it only makes sense to run 15 pounds, not 25. So in that case, you'd want to have the X-ray sources closer than you would at 25.
What's the machine's footprint, and what are some of the power requirements for it?
Well, it's about 5 feet square, but it does stand 8 feet tall. So it's a fairly large machine that's required in order to work with the larger batch sizes. And it's a very powerful machine. So it does require quite a bit of electricity. It's in America, 230 volt, 3-phase, 75 amps. So substantial compared to other types of equipment, but very, very effective because of that high power. And that's what gives it the speed, even at the larger batch sizes.
Is the plan to stick with the CX 1000, or are there plans to maybe do it in a smaller form factor for some of the smaller shops?
There's no plan to do that right now. I've always been a proponent with equipment, and I've designed and managed companies that are equipment manufacturers for most of my career, and simpler is always better. So one size fits all. However, I will say that we do have plans for automation in the future, meaning that if you, let's say you're a grower that only runs one shift today, and there's nobody there on the weekends, this automation idea could be implemented to be able to move bins or trays or whatever in and out of the machine all weekend long. So it just runs continuously without any intervention.
Okay. Is that something that you guys are developing in-house, or are you working with another manufacturer on the automation?
No, that's something we would develop in-house.
Okay. Compared to some of the other industries that you've worked in, how does cannabis compare when it comes to just dealing with operators and, training them up on the equipment?
Don, you can jump in here anytime too. I think, in some of the other businesses we're in, and not just Don and I, but the whole VJ group, it's a very technical audience. Mm-hmm. And one of the things we recognize, this is more, this is not a technical audience, Mm-hmm. So one of the things we try to do is just make things very, very simple. And just what the machine does and how long it takes. And that's why we made the operator interface so simple. I mean, they literally only have to put the product into the machine, close the door, or scan barcodes on the bin first, and that will call up a certain recipe that's been created by somebody else, like a process engineer or somebody like that, and then hit go, and that's it.
And to add to that, I would say that is important because the industry you see the people changing. People are moving, they're taking on new roles quite often. So training can become an issue. But I will say, I think people are very open to new ideas and willing to learn, unlike some of the other industries we've dealt with where people feel they know all the answers in day one. So it makes it very interesting and enjoyable to work within this industry.
I was just speaking to somebody working in extraction with the exact same sort of perspective, where coming from like a food and beverage industry where they have chemists, they have engineers on staff. When you're working with cannabis, after they get the machine in-house, how closely are you working with them in the machine setup? And then is there an ongoing relationship in terms of between you and the customer or the client?
I would say yes, especially, things are still in the infancy today. So we're trying to learn from our customers. We're trying to understand how they're using things, what works, what doesn't work in terms of our user experience and so on. And we're also very, very interested in the testing as that's evolving as well. So we like to get involved with them in the test results and, try to understand how the processes are working and what results we're achieving.
Mark, when does a client find you? Is it when they've got a bad batch and it needs to be remediated now? Or is it after a history of bad batches? Or is it getting ahead of it?
I think it's actually all of the above. I mean, I think there's more and more awareness today, that this is just something, even with GMP, Even if your facility is really, really good at it, there's no such thing as 100%. So I think it's mostly the operators themselves that, recognize that there's a need, for this kind of technology. Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, there's other like Don was mentioning earlier in the food industry. This is something that there's like a lot about the cannabis industry. There's a lot of education that's happening, right? Both in formulations. I mean, that's just a whole area that's just blossoming and exploding. But uh, I don't know, Don, if you want to pick it up from there.
Was the one thing I'm curious about, was the design for the CX-1000, was that borrowed from another industry? Like, did you have the same machine in a different industry, or was it designed specifically to suit cannabis?
It was designed specifically to suit cannabis. As I mentioned very briefly, as we were getting into this, we went and studied some of the other applications, the biggest being food, but food, spices, things like that. There's a number of different service centers and so on. We went out and we visited and we learned what worked there, what didn't work. And then we met with a bunch of cannabis growers. And that's how we came up with the concept. So this is basically new. It looks different than any other model that's out there today. So designed from the ground up for the cannabis industry.
What has been the initial reaction since it hit the market?
Oh, I think excellent. I mean, when we were at MJ BizCon, I mean, a lot of people came around and said, "That's a really nice looking machine." And then, one of the things I directed the team. It's just my own view, but it had to look clean. It had to look, medical grade, if you will, quote unquote. And basically, like the stainless steel fridge that a lot of people have in their kitchen today, on steroids, a big one.
That's one thing I like about the cannabis industry too, is there seems to be kind of a cool factor that people put into the industrial design behind the machine.
Right. No, I think that's true. Especially with the new players, where there's maybe equipment that was used in another industry, and now been kind of modified slightly for the cannabis industry. It looks like it's from another industry, and we didn't want to do that. We started with a clean sheet of paper.
What was the product development process like? How long did it take?
Well, it was very, very quick. Yeah, we actually, like Don said, I think earlier, we probably got introduced to this industry maybe 18 months ago.
Okay.
Went around and did some studies, talked to growers, etc., people in the industry. Learned a lot, but when it came down to it, we really designed it and got our first unit out there in 6 months.
That's incredible. What have customers been asking for, in subsequent iterations, and will you be adding features to existing machines that are out there as they come online, or is it something where they'll need to get a new model? How's that going to work?
I think one of the biggest opportunity areas is probably software.
Okay.
And we spent a lot of time making sure that, again, and not to beat a dead horse here, but to make sure that the operator interface is very simple. It's a very small interface on the machine itself because there's not a lot of inputs. But it's a web-based server architecture, so it's you can run parts of the software on a desktop, on an iPad, on an iPhone, whatever it is. It's all connected together. So, for instance, the more advanced features that someone, an engineer or a process person might have to set up, is all done offline on any kind of device. It doesn't matter what it is, as long as you're connected to the same network. So you can set it up. You can also get all kinds of test data out of it. There's temperature probes in the machine, humidity probes. You can trace the batch IDs. Potentially in the future, even connected into the metric systems that everybody has to use for reporting. It's not something we've done yet, but the potential is there. So,
I'm sure that would be huge in terms of documentation and traceability.
right. Well, and it's great for again, somebody like a process person who wants to look back at, well, geez, this something changed about this after it was this particular batch after it was tested. You can go back and look at all that data and go, oh, look, when we did this, the temperature rose or something, and be able to trace those kind of things back to try to modify the process to have better results.
Sure. Just one comment, if I might. It's also, we're thought of the MSO. You could have a multi-state operator with multiple systems, and their compliance officer could have a desktop in their office and could access all the systems and all the records from those systems.
Very good. Do either of you have a personal connection to cannabis?
I don't.
Historically, yes. I'm not a big time user today, but I certainly understand the clientele quite well.
Understood.
Yeah, we both grew up in the 60s and 70s, so it was there.
Understood. What's next for the two of you, and what's next for VJ Scientific?
That's a good question. We're looking forward to learning more about the industry and watch it as it grows. We want to be an international player. I think there's large opportunities in Europe and other parts of the world. We're working with companies in Colombia, in Israel, Australia, Netherlands. This is really going to become an international adventure, I guess. So, I think as we learn more from customers, we'll integrate those things into the platform. I think there's the automation piece, but just the software itself, I think, is we're probably going to see a lot of growth and a lot of requests for different data outputs or what have you.
Don, is there anything standing in the way of VJ sort of achieving those goals? Has the company been hit by any of the supply chain challenges or material shortages?
Oh, sure. The supply chain is getting better, but even today, for some of the critical components that we use in X-ray, it's slowed us down a little bit. Fortunately, we have the leverage of our larger company that is also using similar components from some of the same suppliers. So I think we're getting through that. I think we're starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel in terms of supplier delays and issues. So I think, yes, I think we're getting there.
Well, before we get out of here, I just wanted to make sure, is there anything else that we might have left out or anything in particular you want to make sure the Cannabis Equipment News audience knows about yourselves or VJ Scientific? Even if it's
That's the only area we probably haven't talked about, David, is our service support.
Okay.
So we've structured a plan and options for customers to support them worldwide. There's certain maintenance intervals that you have to be aware of with X-ray. It's very important. And actually, Don, I think you can speak to this better than I can, but regulated, for inspection. There may be annual inspections for radiation and that sort of thing.
That's right. It varies country by country and even in the US, state by state to some degree, but there are requirements that a qualified person goes in and does some inspection and runs some tests just because it has the potential for becoming a hazard if you don't do that. But it's so well regulated that I think people in general are very, very comfortable using it. And that's the purpose, is to keep it that way.
When it comes to maintenance, what does that look like?
Well, there's very little maintenance on the CX1000. There is high voltage, 160,000 volts being used to generate the X-rays. So there are some connections between the high voltage generator and the X-ray source itself. Those have to be disassembled, cleaned, and they actually use a dielectric grease. It has to be re-greased and reassembled. And depending on usage, that's typically once every 6 months. And then many states and many countries actually require that you do what's called a radiation survey once a year. So that's just a matter of going through with a survey meter, which can sense any leakage of X-ray, and going across all the surfaces to make sure that the shielding is still intact and safe. Then finally, also to double check to make sure all the interlocks are functioning and not showing any wear, because if an interlock fails, it's going to fail in a safe mode, but of course that could potentially bring the system down and take away some productivity.
So with service, we really wanted to do a good job there and have put plans in place to make sure that our customers are well served and they can reach our tech support anytime, anywhere. Because my view is, you sell the product once, but you service it for the life of the product. So that's extremely important.
Where should our listeners and viewers go for additional information, or maybe if they want to start the conversation?
Well, you can go to clean-cannabis.com, which is our website, or you can certainly Google VJ Scientific. That's another way to do it. You can go through LinkedIn. We have a homepage there. Anything else you can think of, Don?
Those are probably the best ways. Obviously, reaching out through our website is a way to get the first round of information, but all of our contact information is there, and we'll reply back. And we're happy to invite people to come in and see us, or have WebEx conferences, that sort of thing. We really look forward to getting the message out there and working more and more with the industry.
Well, thank you both very much for taking the time today. I really do appreciate the insight, particularly when it comes to the safety, just because there's a lot of equipment out in the industry right now. But given the nature of your equipment, there's already so much regulation wrapped around it that it seems like inherently safer than a lot of stuff out there.
Very well could be.
That's true. It's true. The FDA has had, X-ray requirements for more than 30 years for, food products and decontamination of food products and everything else. So something a lot of people probably don't even realize is that spices have been decontaminated with X-rays for many, 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 many years. I like to say, if do you have a spice in your kitchen cabinet that has ever become moldy? I don't think so.
Right.
That's because it's been irradiated.
Oh my goodness! If my Lowry's gets moldy, I don't know what I'm going to do. Well, again, thank you very much for joining me today. And as new developments come out with the company, please come back. I'd like to discuss how the industry is evolving and how you guys fit into it.
Sounds good.
Well, thanks very much for your time, David.
All right. Well, before we get out of here, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe to the podcast. You can also help us out a lot by leaving the podcast a positive review on whatever platform you use. Finally, if you want to email the podcast, you can reach me at david@cannabisequipmentnews.com. All right. For Donald Naugler and Mark Clemons with VJ Scientific, I'm David Manti. This is the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you for listening to the Cannabis Equipment News Podcast.